The dust cloud rising from the canyon road told Clara Brennan that something terrible had happened before she even heard the frantic hoofbeats. And when she saw her beloved mare Sagebrush galloping wild-eyed past the fence line without a rider, her heart dropped like a stone into a frozen well. Clara ran from the small ranch house, her cotton dress catching on the wooden porch railing as she stumbled down the steps, calling out to the terrified animal who had been her constant companion since she had arrived in Wyoming territory 3 years ago in 1879. The mare did not slow, her reins dragging dangerously in the dirt, foam flecking her chestnut coat as she disappeared into the expanse of prairie that stretched beyond the property. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes immediately, not just from fear for the horse, but from the overwhelming cascade of losses that seemed to define her life lately. Her father had died 6 months ago from pneumonia, leaving her alone on this struggling cattle ranch with debts she could barely comprehend, and neighbors who whispered that a 22-year-old woman had no business trying to manage land and livestock by herself. She stood helpless in the yard, watching the dust settle, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her mouth. Sagebrush knew this land, but the mare had never bolted like that before, and Clara had no other horse to ride out after her. The sun blazed overhead in the late July heat, and she knew that a horse running wild in panic could injure herself on the rocky terrain, could get tangled in her own reins, could run herself to exhaustion and collapse miles from anywhere. The thought made Clara's chest tighten with an anxiety that felt like drowning. She was still standing there, tears now streaming freely down her sun-browned cheeks, when she heard the sound of hooves approaching at a steady, controlled pace. Clara turned, shading her eyes against the bright afternoon light, and saw a rider leading Sagebrush by the reins. The mare walked calmly now, her sides still heaving but her panic apparently subdued, and the man on the tall buckskin horse rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in the saddle. As he drew closer, Clara could make out more details. He was tall and lean, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face, a faded blue shirt, and leather chaps that had seen considerable wear. A bandana hung loosely around his neck, and she noticed the way he held himself, straight-backed but relaxed, moving with his horse rather than against it. When he finally reached the yard and pulled his buckskin to a stop, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting, and Clara got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble, a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and eyes the color of slate that seemed to take in everything at once. His expression was serious but not unkind, and when he spoke, his voice was low and measured, with the slight drawl of someone who had grown up somewhere south of Wyoming. "This your mare, miss?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from the way Sagebrush nickered softly at the sight of Clara. Clara could only manage a nod at first, her throat too tight with emotion to form words. She walked forward on shaking legs, reaching for Sagebrush's soft nose, running her hands over the mare's face and neck to check for injuries. The horse was exhausted and still nervous, but appeared unharmed. "She came tearing past me about 2 miles down the road," the cowboy continued, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Looked spooked by something. I managed to catch her reins before she could do herself any damage." "Thank you," Clara managed to say, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you so much. I thought I had lost her. I thought she would hurt herself out there, and I had no way to go after her, and I just—" The words tumbled out in a rush as fresh tears spilled over. All the fear and stress and loneliness of the past months finally overwhelming her ability to maintain composure. The cowboy looked momentarily uncomfortable with her display of emotion, shifting his weight from one booted foot to the other, but his eyes remained kind. "She's safe now, miss. A little rattled, but she'll be fine once she settles down." Clara wiped at her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her outburst but unable to stop the tears. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not usually fall apart like this in front of strangers. It has just been a very difficult time, and Sagebrush is all I have left of my old life, and the thought of losing her too was just—" She trailed off, realizing she was explaining far more than necessary to a man whose name she did not even know. "No apology needed," he said gently. "I understand being attached to a good horse. They are often better company than people." He paused, then added, "My name is James Holloway, though most folks just call me Holt. I have been working on the Double R Ranch about 15 miles north of here, but I am heading south toward Cheyenne to find new work." Clara managed a watery smile and extended her hand, remembering her manners despite her emotional state. "Clara Brennan." "This is the Brennan Ranch, though I suppose it is just my ranch now since my father passed." She felt the strength of his calloused hand as he shook hers briefly, noting the respectful way he released it immediately. "I am very sorry for your loss," Holt said, and the sincerity in his voice suggested he knew something about loss himself. "Are you managing the ranch alone?" The question held no judgment, only curiosity and perhaps concern, but Clara still felt defensive rise in her chest. She had heard variations of that question from every man in the county, usually followed by suggestions that she sell the land or, worse, thinly veiled offers of marriage from men who showed far more interest in her property than in her as a person. "I am," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I know what people think about that, but I grew up on this ranch. I know how to work cattle and mend fences and manage accounts. My father taught me everything he knew." Holt nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I am sure he did." "It takes real courage to hold on to a place like this when the world is telling you to give it up." He looked around the property, taking in the small but sturdy house, the barn that needed some repairs, the corrals where a dozen cattle grazed in the distance. "Looks like you have been keeping things together pretty well." The unexpected validation made Clara's throat tighten again with emotion, but she managed to keep her composure this time. "I am trying. Some days are harder than others." Sagebrush nudged Clara's shoulder with her nose, seeking comfort, and Clara returned her attention to the mare, running her hands down each leg to check for swelling or heat that might indicate injury. As she did, she asked, "Did you see what spooked her? She is normally very steady." "Rattlesnake, most likely," Holt replied, crouching down to examine the mare's legs from the other side. "I saw one on the road just past where I caught up with her. Big one, too. She probably came up on it unexpected-like and panicked." Clara shuddered at the thought. Rattlesnakes were a constant danger in Wyoming territory, and she had developed a healthy fear of them after a ranch hand had nearly died from a bite 2 summers ago. "I should have been more careful. I usually watch the trails carefully in summer, but I was distracted thinking about everything I need to do before winter." "Cannot watch for everything all the time," Holt said reasonably. "Snakes hide in the shade this time of year. Easy to miss them until you are right on top of them." He straightened up, apparently satisfied that Sagebrush had no serious injuries. "If you have a cool place for her, I would let her rest for a while. Give her some water, but not too much at once while she is still heated up." "Yes, of course," Clara said, grateful for the reminder of practical care. "The barn stays fairly cool. I can put her in there." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to come inside for something to drink? It is the least I can do to thank you for bringing her back. You probably rode out of your way, and you must be thirsty in this heat." Holt considered the offer for a moment, glancing at the sun's position in the sky as if calculating how many hours of daylight remained for travel. Finally, he nodded. "I would appreciate that, Miss Brennan, thank you." Clara led Sagebrush into the barn, with Holt following behind leading his buckskin. The interior was indeed much cooler than the blazing heat outside, and the familiar smells of hay and leather and horses helped calm Clara's still jangled nerves. She removed Sagebrush's saddle and bridle, noting the sweat marks on the mare's coat, and gave her a small amount of water from the bucket in her stall. Holt tended to his own horse with the efficient movements of long practice, and Clara noticed the quality of his tack despite its worn appearance. This was a man who took care of his equipment and his animals, which spoke well of his character. When both horses were settled, Clara led Holt to the house, suddenly self-conscious about the state of her small home. She had been too busy with ranch work to pay much attention to housekeeping lately, and she was aware that her dress was dusty and her hair had come loose from its pins. But Holt did not seem to notice or care about such things. He removed his hat when he entered, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long and pressed flat from the hat, and waited politely while Clara poured cool water from the pitcher she kept in the shaded corner of the kitchen. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to the table. "I have some bread I baked yesterday and some preserved peaches if you are hungry." "I would not want to take your food, miss," Holt said, though his eyes lingered on the bread Clara had set out. "You would be doing me a favor," Clara replied honestly. "I always make too much for just myself, and I hate seeing it go to waste." She cut thick slices of the bread and brought out a jar of peaches, setting them on the table with plates and forks. "Please eat." Holt did not need further encouragement. He ate with the appetite of a man who had been working hard and traveling long, but his manners were good, and he did not wolf down the food the way some rough cowboys might have. Between bites, he asked Clara questions about the ranch and how long her family had been in Wyoming, and she found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone in months. "We came here in 1876, she explained, sitting across from him with her own glass of water. "My father had always wanted to raise cattle, and after my mother died of cholera in Kansas, he decided there was nothing keeping us there. We bought this land from a man who was giving up and heading back east, and we spent 3 years building it into something worthwhile." "That was right after the big Indian troubles," Holt observed. "Took courage to come here then," Clara nodded. "My father was not a fearful man. He believed that hard work and fair dealing would see us through, and for the most part he was right. We never had serious trouble with the Arapaho or Shoshone who were still in the area. Father made a point of treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they were." "Sounds like he was a good man," Holt said quietly. "He was." Clara felt the familiar ache of grief settle in her chest. "I still cannot quite believe he is gone. Sometimes I turn to tell him something, and it takes me a moment to remember that he is not here anymore." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Clara found herself studying Holt's face more carefully. There was a sadness in his eyes that suggested he understood loss in a personal way, and she wondered what had brought him to Wyoming, why he was traveling alone to Cheyenne looking for work. As if sensing her curiosity, Holt spoke. "I came up from Texas about 4 years ago. My family had a small ranch outside of San Antonio, but we lost it after my father got sick and could not work. My mother had already passed, and my younger sister went to live with our aunt in Houston. I have been working cattle ever since, moving from ranch to ranch, sending money to my sister when I can." "Do you miss Texas?" Clara asked. "Sometimes," Holt admitted. "I miss the live oaks and the hill country, but Wyoming has its own kind of beauty. The mountains here take your breath away, and there is something about all this open space that makes a man feel like anything is possible." Clara smiled at that. "I know what you mean. When I first saw this land, I thought it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. All that sky going on forever, it made Kansas seem small by comparison." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Clara learned that Holt was 27, that he had learned to ride almost before he could walk, that he had a gift for gentling difficult horses, and preferred working with animals to working with people most of the time. He learned that Clara had taught herself to read advanced books by studying her father's small library, that she could shoot well enough to bring down deer for winter meat, that she had a stubborn streak that made her refuse to give up even when circumstances seemed impossible. The light through the windows had shifted to late afternoon gold when Holt finally stood, reaching for his hat. "I should be moving on," he said, though Clara noticed a certain reluctance in his voice. "I want to cover some more ground before dark." Clara stood as well, surprised by the disappointment she felt at his departure. It had been so long since she had enjoyed anyone's company this much, since she had talked with someone who seemed to understand her rather than merely tolerate her presence or scheme for her property. "Of course," she said. "Thank you again for bringing Sagebrush home. I do not know what I would have done if you had not found her." "I am glad I was in the right place at the right time," Holt replied. He turned his hat in his hands for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something, then asked, "Miss Brennan, I noticed you have some repairs that need doing around the place. The barn door is hanging crooked and some of your fence posts are rotting through. If you were willing to provide meals and a place to sleep in the barn for a few days, I could fix those things for you before I head on to Cheyenne." Clara felt her heart lift at the offer, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "I could not ask you to do that. You said you needed to find work." "A few days will not make much difference," Holt said. "And truth be told, I would feel better knowing someone had looked after those repairs. Your barn door could fall off completely in a strong wind, and that would be a real problem come winter." Clara wanted to accept immediately, but years of her father's teaching about being careful with strangers made her hesitate. Still, her instincts told her that Holt was trustworthy, and she desperately needed help with the heavier repairs she had been putting off. "If you are certain you do not mind," she said slowly, "then I would be very grateful for the help, but you will take meals in the house, not just in the barn, and I insist on paying you something for your time." Holt shook his head. "Meals and a dry place to sleep is payment enough. Consider it my thanks for the kindness you showed me today, feeding me and giving me a chance to rest in the shade." They shook hands on the agreement, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. For the first time in months, she did not feel quite so alone. Over the next several days, Holt proved to be as skilled and hardworking as Clara had hoped. He rose with the sun each morning and worked steadily through the day, pausing only when Clara brought him water or called him in for meals. He repaired the barn door first, planing down the swollen wood and rehinging it so that it swung smoothly. Then he moved on to the fence posts, digging out the rotted ones and replacing them with fresh timber he cut from the small stand of cottonwoods near the creek. Clara worked alongside him when she could, holding posts steady while he tamped earth around them, handing him tools, learning techniques she had not known before. They developed an easy rhythm of working together, and Clara found herself looking forward to each day in a way she had not since before her father's death. Holt was not much of a talker while he worked, but when they took breaks or shared meals, their conversations ranged widely over everything from cattle breeding to books to the political situation in Washington. On the third evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Holt said something that surprised Clara. "You have a real talent for this life," he observed. "I have worked on a lot of ranches, and I can tell the difference between someone who is just going through the motions and someone who genuinely understands the land and the animals. You have good instincts." Clara felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. That means a great deal, especially coming from someone with your experience. Most men around here seem to think I am just a foolish girl playing at ranching until I come to my senses and find a husband to take over." Holt's expression darkened slightly. "Any man who thinks that is a fool himself. You know this land better than most of the cowboys I have worked with. The fact that you are a woman does not change that." "I wish more people thought that way," Clara said softly. "The bank president in town has been pressuring me to sell. He says I will never make the loan payments on my own, that I should accept one of the offers from neighboring ranchers and move somewhere more suitable for a woman." "What do you tell him?" Holt asked. "I tell him that my father built this ranch from nothing, and I intend to honor his memory by keeping it running no matter what it takes." Clara's voice was fierce with determination. I have already survived one winter on my own, and I will survive the next one and the one after that. I am not going to let anyone take this away from me." Holt smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made Clara's breath catch slightly. "I believe you," he said. "You have the kind of stubbornness that gets things done in this country." As the days passed and turned into a week, then nearly 2 weeks, Clara noticed that Holt had not mentioned moving on to Cheyenne again. He had finished the immediate repairs, but had found other projects to occupy himself, replacing worn boards in the corral, patching the roof where rain had been leaking into the tack room, even helping Clara move some of the cattle to better grazing. She did not mention his extended stay, afraid that bringing it up would remind him that he had meant to leave, and he seemed content to continue working without discussing the future. But Clara knew it could not last forever. Holt would eventually need to move on to find proper work that paid real wages, and she would be alone again. The thought filled her with a loneliness that went deeper than anything she had felt before, and she realized with some alarm that she had come to depend not just on Holt's help, but on his presence, his quiet companionship, the way his rare smiles made her feel warm and valued. She was beginning to understand that what she felt for Holt went beyond gratitude or friendship, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. On a warm August morning, nearly 3 weeks after Holt had first brought Sagebrush home, Clara was in the kitchen preparing bread dough when she heard a horse approaching at speed. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and went to the door, surprised to see one of her neighbors, Tom Garrett, riding into the yard. Garrett was a large man in his mid-40s who owned the ranch directly to the east, and he had been one of the men who had made it clear he would be interested in acquiring Clara's property, either through purchase or marriage. "Morning, Miss Brennan," Garrett called out, dismounting heavily. His eyes swept the yard and landed on Holt, who had emerged from the barn at the sound of hoofbeats. "I see you have hired some help. Mr. Holloway has been kind enough to assist me with some repairs," Clara said coolly, not liking the speculation in Garrett's eyes. "Is that so?" Garrett's tone suggested he thought the arrangement was improper. "Well, I hope he is not taking advantage of your generous nature, Miss Brennan. A woman alone cannot be too careful about who she trusts." Clara felt anger flash through her. "I assure you, Mr. Garrett, I am perfectly capable of judging character for myself. Was there something specific you needed?" Garrett's expression hardened slightly at her tone. "I came by to let you know that I have spoken with the bank president, Mr. Wilcox. He mentioned that you are behind on your loan payment. I wanted to make sure you knew that my offer to buy your property still stands. I would give you a fair price, and you could move to town where life would be easier for you." "The payment is not due until September 15th, Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I have 1 month to make up the difference, and I fully intend to do so. And even if I did not, I certainly would not sell to someone who has been conspiring with the banker to pressure me off my own land." "Now, Miss Brennan, there is no conspiracy," Garrett said, though his placating tone only made Clara angrier. "We are all just concerned about your welfare. This is no life for a woman alone. You should be thinking about finding a husband, settling down properly, not working yourself to death trying to run a cattle ranch." "I think Miss Brennan has made her position clear," Holt said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside Clara on the porch. His voice was calm but carried an undertone of steel. "She is not interested in selling, and her personal life is none of your concern." Garrett's face flushed dark red. "I was not aware that hired hands spoke for property owners. Or perhaps your position here is not quite as professional as Miss Brennan suggested?" Clara saw Holt's jaw tighten, but before he could respond, she stepped forward, her own face hot with fury. "How dare you suggest something like that? Mr. Holloway has been nothing but respectful and helpful. You, on the other hand, have no right to come onto my property and insult me or my guests. I would like you to leave now." "You are making a mistake, Miss Brennan," Garrett said, mounting his horse. "This ranch is too much for you and you are going to lose it. When that happens, do not expect anyone to help you." He rode off before Clara could respond, leaving her shaking with anger and, she had to admit, some fear. What Garrett had said about the bank payment was true. She was short on the amount due, and she had been scrambling to figure out how to make up the difference. She had hoped to sell some cattle before September, but prices had been low this summer, and she had not yet found a buyer willing to pay what she needed. "Are you all right?" Holt asked quietly. Clara realized she had wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture she had not been aware of making. "Yes, no, I do not know." She turned to face him. "He was right about one thing. I am behind on the loan payment. Not by much, but enough that it could give the bank an excuse to foreclose if they wanted to, and between Garrett and Wilcox, I suspect they do want to." "How much are you short?" Holt asked. Clara hesitated, then told him the figure. It was not an enormous amount, but for someone in her position, it might as well have been a fortune. "I have been trying to figure out how to raise it, but I do not have enough cattle ready to sell, and nobody wants to pay fair prices right now anyway." Holt was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he said, "I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough to cover what you are short. I could lend it to you." Clara stared at him, stunned. "I could not possibly accept that. You have already done so much, and that is your money, the savings you have worked years to accumulate. What if something happens and I cannot pay you back?" "You will pay me back," Holt said with quiet confidence. "You are too stubborn to let this ranch fail. And if I am honest, Miss Brennan, I have been looking for a reason to stay in this area rather than moving on to Cheyenne. I like this part of Wyoming. I like this ranch, and he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I would like to continue working here if you would be willing to hire me on properly. Not for charity, but as a real ranch hand. You need the help and I need the work. The loan would be separate from that, just one friend helping another." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes for the second time since meeting Holt, but these were tears of gratitude and something deeper, something she was still afraid to name. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked quietly. "You barely know me." Holt met her eyes, and Clara saw something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "I know you better than you think," he said softly. "These past weeks, working alongside you, talking with you, I have come to understand the kind of person you are. You are brave and determined and kind. You work harder than any woman I have ever met, and you do not complain even when things are difficult. You deserve to keep this ranch, and if I can help make that happen, then that is what I want to do." Clara did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Finally, she said, "If you are truly certain, then yes, I would be grateful for the loan. And I would be even more grateful if you would stay on as a hired hand. The truth is, I have been dreading the day you would leave. It has been so much easier having you here, not just because of the work, but because—" She trailed off, not quite brave enough to finish the sentence. "Because," Holt prompted gently. "Because I have not felt alone since you arrived," Clara admitted. "And I had not realized how much the loneliness was weighing on me until it lifted." Holt smiled at that, the expression transforming his face in the way that always made Clara's breath catch. "I have not felt alone either," he said. "Not since I first rode into this yard." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Clara felt something shift between them, some unspoken acknowledgement that what existed between them was more than employer and employee, more than simple friendship. But neither of them was quite ready to put it into words yet, so instead they returned to their work, both of them moving with a new lightness that came from hope. The following week, Clara and Holt rode into town together so that Clara could make her loan payment at the bank. Holt had given her the money in cash, insisting that she could pay him back whenever she was able without interest. Clara had accepted with a mixture of gratitude and determination to repay every cent as quickly as possible. The town of Clearwater was small, consisting of little more than a main street with a general store, a saloon, the bank, a church, and a handful of other businesses. It was also the center of local gossip, and Clara was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed as she and Holt walked from the hitching post to the bank. Inside, Mr. Wilcox looked distinctly unhappy to see Clara with the full payment amount. He was a thin man with a pointed face and small, calculating eyes that reminded Clara of a weasel. "Miss Brennan," he said without warmth, "I confess I am surprised to see you. I had understood from Mr. Garrett that you were having difficulty raising the payment." "Mr. Garrett was misinformed," Clara said coolly, counting out the money onto the counter. "As you can see, I have the full amount due with an extra week to spare before the deadline." Wilcox's lips pressed into a thin line as he counted the money slowly, clearly looking for some excuse to reject it. Finding none, he wrote out a receipt with obvious reluctance. "Very well, the payment is recorded. Though I must say, Miss Brennan, that continuing to struggle along with this ranch seems unwise. You would do better to sell while you still have some equity, rather than waiting until foreclosure leaves you with nothing." "I have no intention of being foreclosed upon," Clara replied, taking the receipt and folding it carefully. "My father built this ranch into something worthwhile, and I intend to continue his work. Good day, Mr. Wilcox." She walked out of the bank with her head high, Holt following close behind, but once they were outside, she felt her hands begin to shake with reaction. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. "You handled that well," Holt said as they walked toward the general store to purchase supplies. "He wanted to rattle you, and you did not give him the satisfaction." "I wanted to tell him what I really thought of him," Clara admitted. "But my father always said that losing your temper in business dealings just makes you look weak." They were loading supplies into the wagon when a woman's voice called out, "Clara Brennan, is that you?" Clara turned to see Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women in town close to her own age. Sarah worked at the general store and had always been kind to Clara, never participating in the gossip the way some of the other townswomen did. "Hello, Sarah," Clara said with genuine warmth. "How are you?" "Busy as always," Sarah replied with a smile. Then her eyes moved to Holt with friendly curiosity. "Are you going to introduce me to your companion?" "Of course. Sarah Mitchell, this is James Holloway. He is working on my ranch. Holt, this is Sarah, who runs the finest general store in the territory." "The only general store in Clearwater," Sarah corrected with a laugh, shaking Holt's hand. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Holloway. Are you planning to stay in the area?" "I am," Holt replied. "Miss Brennan has been kind enough to hire me on permanently." Sarah's eyes moved between them with an assessing look that Clara recognized. Sarah was perceptive, and Clara had the feeling that her friend saw more than Clara was ready to admit even to herself. But Sarah only smiled and said, "That is wonderful news." "Clara needs reliable help, and good ranch hands are hard to find. You must both come to the church social next Saturday. We have one every month, and it would do Clara good to socialize more instead of working all the time." "Oh, I do not know," Clara began, but Sarah cut her off. "No excuses. You barely come to town anymore, and people are starting to think you have become a hermit. Besides, it would be a good chance for Mr. Holloway to meet some of the other folks around here. What do you say?" Clara looked at Holt, who shrugged slightly in a gesture that said the decision was hers. Part of her wanted to refuse, knowing that showing up at a social event with Holt would only fuel more gossip. But another part of her was tired of hiding away on the ranch, tired of letting fear and judgment dictate her choices. "All right," she said. "We will be there." Sarah beamed. "Wonderful. I will see you both on Saturday then." She waved and headed back into the store, leaving Clara and Holt to finish loading the wagon. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara found herself thinking about the upcoming social with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She had not attended any town events since her father's funeral, partly because she had been too busy and partly because she had not been able to face the pitying looks and intrusive questions. But things felt different now. With Holt beside her, she felt more confident, more able to face whatever judgment the town might pass. You do not really have to go if you do not want to, she said as they turned onto the road that led to the ranch. I know social gatherings are not everyone's preference. I do not mind, Holt replied. And Sarah was right that it would be good for you to get out more. You work too hard without taking any time for yourself. That is rich coming from someone who starts working before dawn and does not stop until dark, Clara pointed out with amusement. Holt smiled at that. Fair point. Maybe we both need to learn to take a break now and then. The week leading up to the church social passed quickly, filled with the usual ranch work and a few projects that Holt wanted to complete before winter. He had started to talk about plans for the future, discussing things like building a better shelter for the cattle during harsh weather and clearing more land for hay. Clara noticed that he always phrased these plans as if he would definitely be there to see them through, and she found herself building her own plans around his continued presence. On Saturday, Clara took extra care with her appearance, putting on her best dress, a deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers that her father had bought her for her last birthday. It was the nicest thing she owned, and she had not worn it since his funeral. She braided her long brown hair and pinned it up in a style she hoped looked sophisticated rather than severe, and she even dabbed on a bit of the rose water her mother had made years ago, which had somehow survived all their moves and struggles. When she emerged from her room, Holt was waiting by the wagon, and the way his eyes widened slightly when he saw her made Clara's heart flutter. He had cleaned up as well, shaving carefully and putting on a shirt that looked newer than his usual work clothes, and Clara thought he looked incredibly handsome. You look beautiful, Holt said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Clara blush. Thank you. You look very nice yourself, she replied, accepting his hand to help her up into the wagon seat. The ride to town felt different from their supply trip the week before. There was an awareness between them that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there but was now impossible to ignore. Their shoulders touched as the wagon jolted over the rough road, and Clara found herself acutely conscious of Holt's presence beside her, the warmth of his body, the way he handled the reins with easy competence. The church social was being held in the building that served as both church and community gathering space, and when Clara and Holt arrived, the event was already in full swing. Tables had been set up with food, and people milled about talking and laughing. Clara recognized most of the faces, and she saw the exact moment when people noticed her arrival with Holt. Conversations paused, heads turned, and she knew that by tomorrow, everyone in the county would be speculating about the nature of their relationship. But then Sarah was hurrying over with a welcoming smile and some of Clara's tension eased. I am so glad you came, Sarah said, linking her arm through Clara's. Come on, you need to try the pie that Mrs. Henderson made. It is absolutely delicious. As Sarah drew Clara into the crowd, Holt was quickly surrounded by several of the local ranchers who wanted to know about his experience and where he had worked before. Clara watched him field their questions with quiet confidence, and she noticed that even the men who had been skeptical seemed to warm to him as they talked. The evening passed more pleasantly than Clara had expected. She spent time talking with Sarah and a few of the other women who had always been kind to her, and she even danced several times when the music started. Holt danced with her twice, and though he claimed not to be much of a dancer, he moved well enough and held her with a care that made her feel cherished. It was during their second dance that Tom Garrett approached. He had clearly been drinking, and his face was flushed as he tapped Holt on the shoulder. Mind if I cut in? He said, though his tone made it clear it was not really a request. Holt looked at Clara, letting her make the decision. She wanted to refuse, but they were surrounded by people and she did not want to cause a scene. One dance, she said reluctantly, and Holt stepped back with obvious reluctance. Garrett immediately pulled Clara closer than was proper, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. Seems like you and your hired hand are getting mighty friendly, he said, his words slightly slurred. People are starting to talk, Clara. It does not look good. a young woman living alone on a ranch with a man. "Mr. Holloway is my employee," Clara said stiffly, trying to put more distance between them. "And what people choose to gossip about says more about them than it does about me." "I am just trying to look out for you," Garrett said. "Your father would have wanted someone to watch over you. If you would just be reasonable and marry me, all of this would be solved. You could keep living on your ranch and I would manage the business side of things. You would not have to work so hard anymore." "I have told you before, Mr. Garrett, I am not interested in marriage, especially not to someone who sees me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected," Clara replied, her voice cold. "Now if you will excuse me, this dance is over." She tried to pull away, but Garrett tightened his grip on her waist. "Now hold on just a minute," he began, but then Holt was there, his hand firm on Garrett's shoulder. "The lady said the dance was over," Holt said quietly, but there was an edge to his voice that made several nearby couples stop dancing to watch. Garrett's face darkened with anger. "This is none of your business, Cowboy. Clara and I are having a private conversation." "Miss Brennan has made it clear she wants to leave," Holt replied, his tone unchanged. "I suggest you respect that." For a moment, Clara thought Garrett might actually take a swing at Holt. His hands clenched into fists, and she saw several other men start to move closer, including the town sheriff. But then Garrett seemed to realize where he was, and that he was making a spectacle of himself. He released Clara and stepped back, though his expression remained furious. "This is not over," he said to Clara. "You are going to lose that ranch, and when you do, do not come crying to me for help." He stalked off, and Clara found herself shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The music had stopped and everyone was staring at them. Holt gently took her arm and steered her toward the door. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." Clara did not argue. She collected her shawl and let Holt lead her to the wagon, grateful to escape the stares and whispers. As they drove away from town, tears of frustration finally spilled over and she wiped at them angrily with the back of her hand. "I am sorry," she said. "I have ruined the evening." "You did not ruin anything," Holt said firmly. "Garrett is a bully and a drunk, and what happened was not your fault." "But he is right about one thing," Clara said miserably. "People are talking about us. They think it is improper for you to be living on the ranch. It could hurt your reputation as well as mine." Holt was quiet for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Would it help if people thought we were courting properly? That would make your living situation more respectable, and it would make it clear that Garrett has no claim on you." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "Are you suggesting we pretend to be courting?" "I am suggesting we actually court," Holt replied, turning to look at her. His eyes were serious in the moonlight. "I have been trying to work up the courage to ask you anyway. These past weeks with you have been the happiest I have known in a long time. I enjoy your company, I admire your strength and determination, and I would be honored if you would allow me to court you properly." Clara felt as if all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "You want to court me?" Truly, Holt confirmed. "Unless the idea is unwelcome, in which case I apologize for overstepping." "It is not unwelcome," Clara said quickly, her heart soaring. "Not at all. I have come to care for you a great deal, Holt, more than I probably should have given how recently we met. But I cannot seem to help it. You make me feel safe and valued in a way I have not felt since my father died." Holt reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then it is settled. We are courting, and anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me." Clara laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. The disaster of the evening suddenly did not seem to matter so much. She had Holt beside her, holding her hand, and suddenly the future looked brighter than it had in a very long time. Over the next several weeks, Clara and Holt settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged their changed relationship. They were still careful about propriety, with Holt continuing to sleep in the barn, but they spent their evenings together on the porch talking about everything and nothing. And sometimes Holt would take Clara's hand or brush a strand of hair from her face in gestures that were tender and full of promise. Clara found herself smiling more, laughing at Holt's dry observations about the ranch animals or his stories from his years of traveling. He had a quiet sense of humor that she had not fully appreciated at first, and she discovered that he could be playful in his own reserved way. He also continued to prove himself invaluable as a ranch hand, working tirelessly to improve the property and care for the livestock. As September turned to October and the weather began to cool, Clara realized that she was happier than she had been in years, perhaps happier than she had ever been. The ranch was prospering, the cattle were healthy, and she had Holt by her side. It felt almost too good to be true, and a small part of her waited anxiously for something to go wrong. Her anxiety proved justified when, in mid-October, Tom Garrett rode onto the property once again. This time he was not alone. He was accompanied by Mr. Wilcox from the bank and another man Clara did not recognize, a tall individual in an expensive suit who looked out of place in the rural setting. Clara and Holt emerged from the barn where they had been organizing winter hay, and Clara felt dread settle in her stomach at the sight of the three men. "Miss Brennan," Wilcox said in his oily voice, "I hope we are not interrupting. This is Mr. Nathaniel Crenshaw. He represents a cattle company in Chicago that is looking to acquire ranches in this area." Clara's eyes narrowed. "I am not interested in selling." "I think you should at least hear Mr. Crenshaw out," Garrett said with false friendliness. "He is prepared to make a very generous offer." "Good afternoon, Miss Brennan," Crenshaw said in a cultured Eastern accent. "I assure you our offer is extremely fair. We are prepared to pay well above market value for your property." "I do not care how much you are offering," Clara said flatly. "This ranch is not for sale." Crenshaw's smile tightened slightly. "I understand you have an emotional attachment to the property, Miss Brennan, but you must be practical. The cattle business is changing. Small independent ranchers are being squeezed out by larger operations. It is only a matter of time before you would be forced to sell anyway. Why not do so now while you can get a good price?" "Because this land is my home," Clara said, her voice rising with anger. "My father died to give me this home, and I am not going to hand it over to some company that sees it as nothing but profit." "Now, Clara, be reasonable," Garrett interjected. "This is a good opportunity. You could take the money and start over somewhere easier. Maybe move back east where life would not be so hard for you." "I am not moving anywhere," Clara said fiercely, "and I would appreciate it if all of you would leave my property now." Wilcox stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Miss Brennan, you should know that the bank has concerns about your ability to maintain your loan payments going forward. If you were to default, we would be forced to foreclose, and then you would lose the ranch anyway with nothing to show for it. Are you threatening me?" Clara demanded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Not at all," Wilcox said smoothly. "I am simply pointing out the reality of your situation. Mr. Crenshaw's offer represents security. I would strongly advise you to consider it carefully." "I think you have said enough," Holt interjected, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable warning. "Miss Brennan has made her position clear. The ranch is not for sale. Now I suggest you all leave before this conversation becomes unpleasant." Garrett's face flushed red. "You do not get a say in this, Holloway. This is Clara's decision, and she does not need a hired gun protecting her." "I am not a hired gun," Holt replied evenly. "I am Miss Brennan's business partner and her intended husband, so yes, I do get a say in this." Clara's heart skipped at Holt's words, even though she knew he was exaggerating their relationship to make a point. But the shock on the faces of the three men was worth the small deception. "Is this true?" Wilcox demanded, looking at Clara. "Are you engaged to this man?" Clara made a split-second decision and moved to stand beside Holt, taking his hand. "Yes," she said firmly. "Mr. Holloway and I are planning to be married, so any business discussions about this ranch need to include both of us, and we are both telling you that we are not interested in selling." Crenshaw's expression had turned cold. "I see. Well, this is disappointing but not entirely unexpected. However, Miss Brennan, I feel I should warn you that my company is very determined to acquire land in this region. We have ways of encouraging reluctant sellers to reconsider. I would hate to see you suffer consequences that could have been avoided." "Is that a threat?" Holt asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is merely a statement of fact," Crenshaw replied. "Business can be quite ruthless, Mr. Holloway. I am sure you understand." He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Good day to you both. I suspect we will speak again." The three men rode off, leaving Clara and Holt standing in tense silence. As soon as they were out of sight, Clara turned to Holt, her eyes wide. "I am so sorry. I should not have said we were engaged without asking you first. I just panicked and I thought it would make them back off." Holt looked down at their still joined hands, then back up at Clara's face. "What if we made it real?" he asked quietly, Clara's breath caught. "What?" "Marry me," Holt said, turning to face her fully and taking both her hands in his. "Not because of Garrett or Wilcox or some Chicago cattle company, but because I love you. I have been in love with you for weeks now, maybe since the first day I brought Sagebrush home and saw how much you cared. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life by your side. So marry me, Clara, please." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Holt, so much that it scares me sometimes." Holt pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, and Clara felt as if all the broken pieces inside her were finally being put back together. When he finally released her enough to look down at her face, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I know I do not have much to offer you," he said. "No land of my own, just some savings and my ability to work. But I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy and to help you keep this ranch running." "You have already given me everything I need," Clara said, reaching up to touch his face. "You have given me hope and companionship and love. The rest we will figure out together." Holt smiled at that, then slowly, giving Clara plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise, and Clara felt warmth spread through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. "We should probably make this engagement official," Holt said. "I do not have a ring to give you right now, but I will get one as soon as I can." "I do not need a ring," Clara assured him. "Well, not right away at least. But we should probably tell people before the gossip gets even worse than it already is." They decided to ride into town the next day to speak with the minister about arranging a wedding. Clara wanted to be married soon, both because she genuinely could not wait to start her life with Holt, and because she knew that being married would make it much harder for people like Garrett and Wilcox to pressure her about the ranch. The minister, Reverend Matthews, was a kind, older man who had presided over Clara's father's funeral. He seemed genuinely pleased by the news of their engagement and agreed to marry them the following Saturday. "I think your father would have approved of Mr. Holloway," he told Clara gently. "From what I have heard, he is a good man who works hard and treats people with respect. Those are qualities worth more than gold." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her father, and she wondered if Reverend Matthews was right. Would her father have approved? She thought he would have. Her father had always valued character over wealth or social standing, and Holt embodied all the qualities her father had admired. The news of Clara and Holt's engagement spread through town with impressive speed. Sarah Mitchell was one of the first to congratulate them, hugging Clara tightly, and declaring that she had known they were falling in love even if they had not admitted it to themselves yet. Other townspeople were more reserved in their reactions, particularly those who had been hoping Clara would give up the ranch, but most people seemed to accept the match. Tom Garrett, predictably, was furious. He confronted Holt one day when Holt was in town picking up supplies, his face red with anger and whiskey. "You think you are pretty clever, don't you?" he snarled, swooping in and stealing that ranch right out from under everyone. "I am not stealing anything," Holt replied calmly. I am marrying the woman I love. The ranch belongs to Clara, not to me. That's what you say now, Garrett sneered. But once you are married, what is hers becomes yours. That is how the law works. You are just a fortune hunter, same as all the others. Holt's expression hardened. I am going to say this once, Garrett. What exists between Clara and me is none of your business. She made it clear she was not interested in you long before I came along. Now I suggest you back off and find something else to occupy your time, because Clara and I are getting married whether you like it or not. Garrett looked like he wanted to throw a punch, but they were standing in the middle of the street with plenty of witnesses, and even drunk. He was not foolish enough to start a fight he might lose. Instead, he spat on the ground near Holt's feet and stalked away, leaving Holt shaking his head at the man's childishness. The week leading up to the wedding was a whirlwind of activity. Clara had little in the way of nice things for a wedding, but Sarah helped her alter a dress that had belonged to Clara's mother, and several of the neighbor women donated flowers from their late-season gardens to decorate the church. It was not going to be a grand affair, but Clara did not care about that. All she cared about was marrying Holt and starting their life together. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke early with butterflies in her stomach. She bathed carefully and dressed in her mother's altered gown, a simple but elegant cream-colored dress with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Sarah arrived to help her with her hair, pinning it up with the flowers that would serve as her only adornment. You look beautiful, Sarah said, her eyes suspiciously bright with tears. Holt is a lucky man. I am the lucky one, Clara replied softly. He came into my life when I needed someone most, and he has been nothing but kind and supportive. I do not know what I did to deserve him. You deserve all the happiness in the world, Sarah said firmly. After everything you have been through, you deserve someone who will love you and stand beside you, and Holt is clearly that person. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. The small church was filled with those townspeople who genuinely wished Clara well, and Holt stood at the altar looking handsome and slightly nervous in his best clothes. When Clara walked down the aisle, his face lit up with such joy that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Reverend Matthews led them through their vows, and when Holt promised to love and cherish Clara for the rest of his life, she could hear the sincerity in every word. When it came time for Clara's vows, her voice was steady and strong as she promised the same, meaning every syllable with all her heart. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Matthews said with a warm smile. Mr. Holloway, you may kiss your bride. Holt did so tenderly, cupping Clara's face in his hands as if she were something precious and fragile. The small congregation applauded, and Clara felt a surge of pure happiness. She was married. She had a partner now, someone to share her life and her dreams with. The lonely days were over. The celebration after the ceremony was modest, with cake and punch in the church hall, but Clara enjoyed every minute of it. She danced with Holt, laughed with Sarah and the other friendly townspeople, and accepted congratulations from people she had not expected to support her. Even some of those who had been skeptical about her ability to run the ranch seemed willing to give her another chance now that she had a husband to help her. Tom Garrett did not attend the wedding, which was a relief to everyone. But Mr. Wilcox did make an appearance, and while he offered stiff congratulations, Clara could see the calculation in his eyes. He was not done making trouble for them, she was certain of that. As the afternoon drew to a close, Clara and Holt finally left for home, riding side by side in the wagon. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and the mountains in the distance were already dusted with the first snows of the season. Winter would be coming soon, but Clara felt ready to face it now with Holt beside her. When they arrived at the ranch, Holt helped Clara down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" she asked with a laugh. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Holt replied. "It is supposed to be good luck." Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him as he carried her into the house. It was the same small ranch house she had lived in for 3 years, but somehow it felt entirely different now. It was not just her home anymore. It was their home, the beginning of their life together. That night, as Clara lay in Holt's arms for the first time as his wife, she felt a sense of peace and contentment she had never known before. All the struggles and losses of the past seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the joy of the present and the promise of the future. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness. "I love you too," Holt replied, his arms tightening around her. "Always." The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and growth. Clara and Holt worked together to prepare the ranch for winter, repairing buildings, stockpiling hay and firewood, and moving the cattle to more sheltered pastures. They developed an even stronger working partnership than before, anticipating each other's needs and preferences, moving through their days with the easy synchronization of two people who understood each other deeply. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their plans for the ranch. Holt had ideas for expansion and improvement that excited Clara, and they began to dream together about what they might accomplish in the years to come. They talked about breeding better cattle, adding horses to their stock, maybe even buying adjacent land if it ever became available. But their happiness was shadowed by the continued pressure from outside forces. Mr. Crenshaw's cattle company did not give up on acquiring land in the area, and several of their neighbors sold out over the winter months. Each time another family left, Clara felt the circle tightening around them. Then in February of 1880, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the barn in the middle of the night, and by the time Clara and Holt became aware of it, flames were already engulfing one side of the structure. They managed to get all the horses out safely, but a significant portion of their winter hay stores was destroyed, and damage to the barn itself was extensive. As they stood in the cold night air watching the flames die down, Clara felt tears of frustration and despair streaming down her face. "How are we going to afford to rebuild?" she asked Holt. "We barely had enough saved for spring, and now we have to replace the hay and repair the barn." Holt pulled her close, his own face grim. "We will figure it out," he said. "We always do." But the next day brought even worse news. The sheriff rode out to inform them that evidence suggested the fire had been deliberately set. Someone had doused the side of the barn with kerosene and lit it. The arson had nearly killed them both and had destroyed months of hard work. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" The sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. "I have some ideas," Holt said darkly, "but without proof there is not much we can do." The sheriff nodded sympathetically. "I will ask around, but you are right that we need evidence. In the meantime, I would suggest you both be extra careful. Keep your rifles handy and maybe consider taking turns keeping watch at night." After the sheriff left, Clara and Holt sat at the kitchen table trying to figure out their next steps. The damage was severe enough that they would likely have to take out an additional loan to cover repairs and replacement costs. Clara knew that Wilcox would be delighted to have more leverage over them. "Maybe we should consider selling," Clara said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I do not want to, but I also do not want us to spend our lives fighting a battle we cannot win, and I certainly do not want you to be hurt or worse because of my stubbornness." Holt reached across the table and took her hand. "We are not selling. This is your family's land, and I will be damned if I let some bully or corrupt cattle company drive us off it. We will find a way through this." His certainty gave Clara strength, but she still felt the weight of fear pressing down on her. That night, as they lay in bed, she clung to Holt tightly, terrified of what might happen next. Over the following weeks, they began the slow process of rebuilding. Holt did most of the carpentry work himself, with Clara helping where she could, and gradually the barn began to take shape again. They were forced to take out a small loan from the bank, and Wilcox's satisfaction was visible as he processed the paperwork. "I hope you understand the position you are putting yourselves in," he said unctuously. "Additional debt makes your situation quite precarious. If you were to default on any payment, we would have no choice but to call in all your loans. "We understand perfectly," Clara said coldly, "and we will make every payment on time just as we always have," but privately she was not so confident. The fire had set them back significantly, and she was not sure how they would manage to make both the regular loan payment and the additional one for the repairs. Their salvation came from an unexpected source. In early March, a representative from Fort Laramie contacted them about providing beef to the Army. The military was expanding its presence in Wyoming, and they needed reliable suppliers. The contract would not make them rich, but it would provide steady income and would be enough to cover their loan payments with some left over. Clara and Holt celebrated the news with cautious optimism. It felt like their luck was finally turning, like they might actually be able to build the future they had been dreaming about. But Tom Garrett and Mr. Crenshaw were not done with them yet. In April, just as Clara and Holt were preparing their first shipment of cattle for the Army, several of their best animals went missing. Holt tracked them for 2 days and finally found them on Garrett's property, conveniently mixed in with his own herd. Holt confronted Garrett with the sheriff present, but Garrett claimed the cattle had wandered onto his land and that he had no idea they belonged to the Holloway Ranch. Without clear proof that Garrett had stolen them, the sheriff could only encourage him to return the animals, which he did with obvious reluctance. "This is getting dangerous," the sheriff told Holt privately. "Garrett is feeling desperate, and desperate men do foolish things. You need to watch your back." Holt took the warning seriously. He began carrying his rifle with him even when doing routine work around the ranch, and he and Clara developed a system of signals in case either of them needed help. Clara hated living in a state of constant vigilance, but she understood the necessity of it. The tension came to a head in May. Clara had ridden into town alone to pick up supplies over Holt's objections, and on her way home she was intercepted by Garrett and 2 of his ranch hands. They blocked the road, and Garrett approached her wagon with an expression that made Clara's blood run cold. "Time to have a serious conversation, Clara," he said, and the use of her first name without permission made her skin crawl. "Get out of my way, Mr. Garrett," Clara said, keeping her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "Not until you listen to what I have to say," Garrett replied. "You have been causing a lot of trouble for me and my business associates. That contract with the Army should have gone to established ranchers, not to some woman playing at running a ranch with her cowboy husband." "I earned that contract fairly," Clara said, her hands tightening on the reins. "If you have a problem with that, take it up with the Army." "See, that is your mistake right there," Garrett said, moving closer to the wagon. "You keep thinking you can operate the same as a man, but you cannot. Women need to know their place, Clara, and yours is not trying to compete with real ranchers." One of the ranch hands had circled around behind the wagon, blocking her retreat, and Clara realized with growing alarm that she was trapped. She casually moved her hand toward the rifle she kept under the wagon seat, trying to calculate whether she could reach it in time if things turned violent. But then the sound of hoofbeats made everyone turn, and Clara felt a surge of relief as Holt came galloping up on his buckskin, his own rifle already drawn and pointed at Garrett. "Step away from my wife," Holt said, his voice deadly calm. "Right now." Garrett's face flushed red, but he backed away from the wagon, his hands raised in a gesture of mock innocence. "We were just having a conversation, Holloway. No need to get violent." "The conversation is over," Holt said flatly. "And if I ever catch you near my wife again without her invitation, conversation is not what we will be having. Do you understand me?" For a moment, Clara thought Garrett might actually be stupid enough to go for his gun. But then one of his ranch hands muttered something about not wanting trouble with the law, and Garrett seemed to deflate slightly. "This is not over," he said to Clara and Holt. "You think you are so clever, but you are going to lose everything. I will make sure of it." He and his men rode off, and Holt immediately turned to Clara, his face pale beneath his tan. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine," Clara assured him, though she was shaking with reaction now that the danger had passed. "How did you know where to find me?" "I had a bad feeling about you going to town alone," Holt admitted. "So I followed at a distance, just to make sure you were safe. Thank God I did." He holstered his rifle and moved his horse closer to the wagon, reaching out to take Clara's hand. "Clara, I know you value your independence, but we cannot take chances like this anymore. Garrett has gone beyond harassment into actual threats." "I know," Clara said quietly. "You are right. I should have listened to you about not going alone." They continued home together, both of them shaken by how close things had come to real violence. That night, they sat up late discussing what to do. They could not live like this indefinitely, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when the next attack might come. "We could report everything to the territorial marshal," Holt suggested. "The sheriff means well, but he does not have the authority or the resources to take on someone like Crenshaw's cattle company." Clara nodded slowly. "That might help. And I think we should also write to the newspaper in Cheyenne, tell them what is happening here. If enough people know about the intimidation tactics these companies are using, maybe public pressure will force them to back off." It was a long shot, but they decided it was worth trying. Holt wrote a detailed letter to the territorial marshal outlining everything that had happened, from the fire to the stolen cattle to Garrett's threatening behavior. Clara wrote a separate letter to the Cheyenne newspaper, describing the challenges small ranchers faced when larger interests wanted their land. They did not know if either letter would help, but at least they were doing something rather than just waiting for the next disaster. To their surprise, both efforts bore fruit. The territorial marshal sent a deputy to investigate, and while he could not prove anything definitively, his presence alone seemed to cool some of the overt harassment. The newspaper published Clara's letter along with an editorial condemning the strong-arm tactics being used by outside cattle companies. And suddenly, what had been a local issue became a territorial concern. Other small ranchers who had been facing similar pressure began to speak up, and a coalition formed to lobby the territorial legislature for protections. Clara and Holt found themselves at the center of a movement larger than they had anticipated, and while it was sometimes overwhelming, it also felt good to be fighting back. Through it all, their love for each other deepened. The challenges they faced together only strengthened their bond, and Clara marveled at how completely Holt had become the center of her world. He was her partner in every sense, sharing her burdens and her joys, supporting her dreams while building his own. In June, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, with symptoms she initially attributed to stress, but when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the second time, she could no longer deny the truth. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She wanted children with Holt desperately, but the timing seemed terrible given everything they were dealing with. When she told Holt, his reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around in a circle before setting her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Clara asked, searching his face. "I know the timing is not ideal with everything else going on. I am thrilled," Holt assured her, cupping her face in his hands. "This is the best news I could imagine. We are going to be parents, Clara. We are going to have a family." The knowledge that a baby was coming gave both of them renewed determination to secure their future. They worked harder than ever to make the ranch profitable, and slowly but surely, they began to see real progress. The Army contract provided steady income, and they were able to pay down their debts faster than anticipated. They even managed to save a little, building a cushion against future disasters. As Clara's pregnancy progressed through the summer and fall, Holt became increasingly protective, taking on more of the physical work himself and insisting that Clara rest whenever possible. Clara found his concern endearing if sometimes frustrating, but she understood it came from love, and allowed him to fuss over her. In October, as the first anniversary of their wedding approached, they received news that made all their struggles worthwhile. The territorial legislature had passed new regulations limiting the tactics cattle companies could use to acquire land, and Mr. Crenshaw's company was pulling out of Wyoming entirely, focusing their efforts on Montana instead. The pressure that had been bearing down on them for a year suddenly lifted. Tom Garrett, deprived of his powerful allies and facing increasing scrutiny for his behavior, decided to sell his ranch and move to Colorado. Clara and Holt were able to purchase a portion of his land at a fair price, expanding their own holdings significantly. "We did it," Clara said in wonder as she and Holt stood looking over their expanded property. "We actually kept the ranch and made it grow." "You did it," Holt corrected, pulling her close. "I just helped. Your courage and determination saved this place." "Our courage," Clara insisted, "and our determination, we saved it together." Their first child, a son they named Daniel after Clara's father, was born in February of 1881 on a snowy morning that seemed to promise new beginnings. Holt was present for the birth, holding Clara's hand through the long hours of labor, and when he finally held his son for the first time, Clara saw tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Holt whispered, cradling the tiny baby with infinite gentleness. "He is absolutely perfect." Clara, exhausted but happier than she had ever been, reached out to touch her son's soft hair. "Our family," she said softly, "our beautiful family." As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Clara and Holt proved to be natural parents, sharing the responsibilities of childcare while still managing the ranch. They hired 2 permanent ranch hands to help with the increased workload, good men who respected Clara and appreciated Holt's fair treatment. In 1883, they welcomed a daughter they named Mary, and 2 years after that, a second son called William. The small ranch house was filled with the sounds of children playing, and Clara often marveled at how dramatically her life had changed since that desperate day when Sagebrush had bolted. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Holt one evening as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. "Coming here, staying here, tying yourself to me and this ranch." Holt turned to look at her with such love in his eyes that Clara felt her breath catch. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You and this family are the best things that ever happened to me. Every choice I made that brought me here was the right one." Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, and knew that he spoke the absolute truth. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch but a genuine partnership, a loving marriage, and a beautiful family. As the years passed, their 3 children grew strong and healthy, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with ranch chores as soon as they were old enough, and absorbing the values Clara and Holt worked to instill. Daniel showed his grandfather's gift for working with cattle, Mary had her mother's stubbornness and determination, and William inherited his father's quiet competence and gentle nature. The Holloway Ranch became known throughout Wyoming territory as a model of what small ranchers could achieve through hard work and good management. Other families facing pressure from larger interests came to Clara and Holt for advice, and they shared what they had learned freely, believing that strong communities were built on mutual support rather than ruthless competition. Sarah Mitchell remained Clara's closest friend, and her own marriage to the town blacksmith meant that their families grew close, with their children playing together whenever they visited town. The friendship sustained Clara through both joys and challenges, reminding her that she was not alone even in the most difficult moments. Sagebrush, the mare whose bolting had first brought Holt into Clara's life, lived to a remarkable old age, eventually becoming too old for riding but serving as a gentle companion for the children to practice on. Clara often thought about that terrifying day when she had thought she had lost everything, only to have Holt ride into her life and change it forever. In 1889, Wyoming achieved statehood, and Clara and Holt celebrated along with the rest of the territory. They had survived the wild frontier days and emerged stronger, their ranch now a permanent fixture in a changing landscape. The days of constant danger and uncertainty were behind them, replaced by the more ordinary challenges of raising children, managing livestock, and maintaining their property. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Holt surprised Clara by commissioning a sign for the ranch entrance. It read Holloway Family Ranch, established 1876, honoring both Clara's father who had founded the place and the family they had built together. "It is perfect," Clara said, tears in her eyes as she looked at the sign. Thank you," Holt replied, pulling her into his arms, "for giving me a home and a family, for loving me, for being the most remarkable woman I have ever known." They kissed in the shadow of the sign that marked their shared legacy, surrounded by the land they had fought so hard to keep and the family that was their greatest achievement. As Clara stood there in her husband's embrace, she thought about all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. If Sagebrush had not bolted that day, if Holt had not happened to be riding by at just the right time, if he had simply returned the horse and ridden on instead of offering to help with repairs. So many small choices and chance encounters that had led to this beautiful life. "What are you thinking about?" Holt asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how everything had to happen exactly the way it did for us to end up here," Clara said. "About how grateful I am that you brought my horse back that day." Holt smiled, remembering, "I am grateful too, for that day and every day since. You are my home, Clara. You and our children and this land, I would not change a single moment." Clara reached up to kiss him again, her heart full to overflowing with love and contentment. She had lost so much in her young life, her mother, her father, nearly the ranch itself. But she had also gained everything that truly mattered: love, partnership, family, and the satisfaction of building something lasting through courage and determination. As the sun set over the Wyoming landscape they both loved, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose, Clara and Holt walked back to their house hand in hand. Inside, their children were waiting, their laughter drifting through the open windows. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, and Clara would not have traded it for anything in the world. The ranch continued to prosper through the 1890s and into the new century. Daniel eventually took over much of the day-to-day management, showing the same dedication his parents had always demonstrated. Mary married a neighboring rancher's son and started a ranch of her own, proving that a woman could succeed in the cattle business just as her mother had. William became a veterinarian, applying his gentle nature and intelligence to caring for animals throughout the region. Clara and Holt grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents many times over, delighting in watching their children raise families of their own. They never forgot the struggles of their early years together, and they made sure their children and grandchildren understood the value of hard work, integrity, and standing up for what was right. On quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence in comfortable silence. Clara would often reflect on that day so many years ago when she had stood in her yard crying, certain that she had lost everything, only to have a stranger ride up leading her runaway horse. That moment when she had opened the door to him, tears streaming down her face, and he had handed her Sagebrush's reins with such kindness in his eyes had been the beginning of everything good in her life. The moment when she had instinctively held him after he brought her mare home, clinging to him in gratitude and relief, had been the first step toward the love that had sustained them through decades of partnership. "What would have become of me if you had not found Sagebrush that day?" Clara asked Holt one evening when they were both well into their 60s, their hair silver and their hands marked by a lifetime of work. Holt considered the question seriously, as he always did when Clara asked him something. "You would have survived," he said finally. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," You would have found a way. Maybe, Clara conceded, but I would not have been happy, not the way I have been with you. You gave me so much more than help with the ranch. You gave me partnership and love and a family. You gave me everything I did not even know I needed. We gave those things to each other, Holt replied, taking her weathered hand in his. I was drifting before I met you, just moving from place to place without purpose. You gave me a home and a reason to stay in one place. You made me want to build something permanent instead of always moving on. They sat in companionable silence as the sun set over land that had been theirs for more than 3 decades now, land they had fought for and improved and passed on to their children. The ranch that had once seemed so precarious was now firmly established, a legacy that would continue for generations. Clara thought about all the moments that had made up their life together. The day Holt had proposed in the aftermath of threats from Garrett and the cattle company. Their simple but heartfelt wedding. The night Daniel was born and Holt had held their son with such wonder and love. Mary's determination as a little girl to do everything her brothers could do. William's gentle humor and perceptive insights. The years of hard work and harder challenges overcome together. Every moment had been precious, even the difficult ones, because they had faced everything together. That was what marriage truly meant, Clara had learned. Not just sharing the good times, but standing together through the struggles, supporting each other when things seemed impossible, celebrating victories won through mutual effort. As night fell and they finally went inside to the home they had shared for so long, Clara felt profound gratitude for the life they had built. The scared, lonely young woman who had thought she was losing everything when her horse bolted had found so much more than she ever could have imagined. She had found love and partnership, family and security, purpose and contentment. And it had all started with a cowboy who had been kind enough to chase down a runaway horse and return it to its grateful owner. Such a small act of kindness, but it had changed everything. Clara had learned that sometimes the most profound transformations came from the smallest moments, from choices made without knowing their full significance. She had held him that first day, clinging to him in tears of relief and gratitude, not knowing that she was holding the man who would become her whole world. And he had accepted her gratitude with quiet kindness, not knowing that he had just found the woman who would give his life meaning and purpose. It was, Clara often thought, exactly how love should be. Unexpected, transformative, and absolutely worth every challenge it brought. As she lay down beside Holt that night, as she had for more than 30 years, she whispered the same words she had said so many times before, "I love you." And Holt, as he always did, replied immediately, "I love you too, always." It was a promise he had kept every single day since that afternoon when he had ridden up leading her runaway mare, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that he would keep it until his last breath, just as she would keep the same promise to him. That was what true love meant, and Clara was grateful beyond measure that she had found it with this quiet, steadfast man who had come into her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. Their story had begun with tears and a bolting horse, with fear and desperate gratitude. But it had become something beautiful and lasting, a love story that would be told in their family for generations. The legacy of the cowboy who brought back a runaway horse and stayed to build a life with the woman who had held him in tears and discovered in his arms the home she had been searching for all along.